Hi everyone, this is Shireen Chahawi. I am the Executive Director of the Friends of the Kotzschmar Organ. I'm here today with James Kennerly, Portland's municipal organist, and we're just going to chit-chat about our upcoming concert, our Bach Birthday Bash, which will be live streaming on March 20th, and then available for online viewing between March 21st and the 31st, and you can buy your access at any time during the window between March 20th and March 31st. And we hope you will join us. Oh, I'm seeing people jump on. Hi, guys. But let me just bring on James Kennerly. That's who you're here to see. James Kennerly, Portland's municipal organist, number 11, as we say on his signature. So please welcome James, and he'll talk to you a little bit about the Bach Birthday Bash.
Thanks, Shireen. Hi, everybody. Excuse our wobbly phone stand here. It's great to see everyone, and it's lovely to be here. In Merrill Auditorium, you can see the mighty Kotzschmar organ behind me, and it's lovely to be making live music, which is something that so many performers have just not been able to do, really, for a year now. And because the organ is the one-person orchestra, the original and the best, then we don't have to make music with other people, although that's a lovely thing to do. So it's always great to be able to be here and enjoy this marvelous instrument, although it's very sad, of course, that we don't have you here with us in person. But we have fantastic audiovisual ways of bringing this organ to you in the comfort of your living room or your car or wherever you happen to be. And so I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the program that we have coming up later this month to celebrate Bach's birthday. I actually forget precisely how old he's going to be. He was born in 1685, and my brain is fried because I had to do church this morning. So maybe, Shireen, you can work out 2021 minus 1685, and that's how old he's going to be. Although at that time, the calendars were running on a slightly different track. We now use the Gregorian calendar, but at the time of Bach, there was a little bit of a shift, and so we have to, there is some dispute over exactly which day he was born in March, particularly. So yeah, the beginning of the program is actually drawn from a collection of organ music Bach published. And it was unusual in Bach's time to publish music in the way that we do now. Nowadays we can type up our music ourselves on engraving software. We can put it out in PDF form, and anyone in the world can download it within seconds of it being composed. But in Bach's day, it was a very expensive expedition. You had to, of course, compose the music, and then you had to try it out with your pupils and in concert. And when you had music you thought was good enough to publish, then you had to essentially pay for it yourself. The idea of the publishing house, as we know it now, wasn't really in full force. In fact, Bach self-published all of the pieces that he did publish during his lifetime. But in the 1720s and 30s, he publishes 4 volumes, and actually into 1740, 4 volumes of keyboard music. Now that tells us a lot about Bach, because for most of his life he was at the, professionally, he was at the St. Thomas Church, the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. And when he was there, he was the director of the choir school. He was the cantor, as it's called in the German Lutheran tradition. And so he wasn't employed as an organist, really. He was employed as a choir director, as a choir trainer. They had a choir of men and boys, and some of those boys, when their voices changed or they became all low, he would farm them out to copy out music parts, or maybe they would play an instrument. And his sons, for example, Wilhelm Friedmann, I'm told Bach is 335 years old. He looks great. Thank you, whoever put that one up. That Bach was really a composer and a music director at that time, and yet he publishes, so he's choosing at his personal great expense to share with the world these 4 collections of keyboard music. The first one are the 6 partitas, that's the Italian word for suites, so it's a collection of keyboard music based on dance forms for the harpsichord, although it could also be for the clavichord. That's like a slightly smaller version of a keyboard instrument that you would have in your home, much more accessible. It was Bach's favorite, actually. I'm sorry, organ. But Bach's favorite keyboard instrument was the clavichord, which is uses a series of keys like you would see on a regular organ or piano, but it hits with a piece of metal called a tangent, and it hits the string little bit like a modern piano. You have a felt hammer that hits the string, but this is a metal tangent, so it has a bit more of a, I don't want to say tinny, but more articulate sound. T, 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 T. Very good for the music of Bach. You can articulate very beautifully. So that was the part one. Part two was the French Overture and the Italian Concerto. Two different styles, the sort of two styles of the day, the Italian style and the French style. One of them is in F major, which is a nice, bright, happy, sunny key. And then the French Overture is in B minor, which is as far away as you can get from F major. F major, B minor. So he's making a very clear statement here. Hey, I'm the master of all these styles and the master of all the keys on the keyboard. And then the third part, which is the one that concerns us, is they're all called the Clavier-Übung, which means the keyboard practice. And the third one is specifically for the pipe organ. And I don't know if you can see this here. This is the title page. It may be in inverse. But either way, you can imagine this is beautifully engraved. Hundreds of copies were produced, and I'm going to show you the first piece in that. Again, I hope you can see this in regular form, but this is you can see in the top there, the Preludium, the Prelude pro Organoplano, for full organ. And so what that means is that Bach is introducing this third collection of organ music. It's really tracing the various musical elements of the German Lutheran Mass. The celebration of the Eucharist would have happened every Sunday, and the pro Organoplano is important. That means for the full organ. And so I thought I would talk about what that means, because when we sit down to one of these magnificent organ consoles, whether it's an organ that Bach would have played or an instrument like this that he certainly wouldn't have played, it was built in 1912 in a much later style, it still tells us what sounds he would want. And so we always start with a principle. It's a sound, a diapason. It's not a principle, but it's called a principle. If you see these pipes behind me, those are principal pipes. They're diapason pipes. It's sort of the fundamental tone of the organ. It sounds a bit like this. And that's principle 8. Acht Fuß, as the Germans would say, 8 foot. That means that the longest note, which is all the way down at the bottom of the keyboard, if you can hear that, that pipe is just, give or take, 8 feet long. So that tells us the fundamental pitch of that stop is 8 foot. This is middle C. I'm going to play it to you. And that's the same pitch, again, give or take a few cents of tuning, as you'd find on a modern piano. So that's middle C, 8 foot. Now, the organ also has different pitches. Here's a 4 foot. Remember, we're looking at this sound Bach is looking for called the Organoplano. So we're adding the 4 foot to that 8 foot. So it actually sounds an octave higher. So I add the 8 and 4 together. And it becomes slightly richer, a little bit more vibrant. Now it keeps going. I have a 2 foot, which means the lowest pipe is 2 feet long. That sounds 2 octaves, that's sort of 2 notes above the original 8 foot. We have the 8 foot, then we have the 4 foot, and now we have the 2 foot, an octave higher than that. So the 8 and 4, 2 together, 4, 2. Again, you're sounding a little bit more like that traditional organ sound. Now, wait, there's more. There is what we call a mixture, and Bach had several of these on the instruments that he played. And the mixture actually is exactly what it sounds. It's a mixture of pipes that all sound at the same time. And the one we have here actually has 5 different pipes, 5 different pitches that all play at once. If I play at the bottom, you can hear some of them. So actually we're getting something like that. All those notes play at once. And so on. So when I add the mixture to the 8, 4, and the 2, the 8, the 4, the 2, and the mixture, we have what we call our Organoplano. Now we can add to that, if we wanted to make it a little bit more grand, add a bit of gravitas, we add what we call a 16-foot, so the longest pipe is 16 feet long, and it makes it sound a little bit more sort of grave. If you listen to the 16 on its own, it sounds very bassy. But if you add that to the ensemble, here we go, solo 2. So I'm going to show you that regular 8, 4, 2 mixture, and here's the 16. So it just adds a little bit more gravitas. If I want to spice it up a little bit more than that, I can add what we call the reed stops. So these are modeled after brass instruments like trumpets, trombones, tubas, a little bit later, and here's one here. And Bach had organs with these kinds of sounds. So again, we're trying to do what Bach said, at least at the beginning, because he's the boss, really. So the 8, the 4, the 2, the mixture, the 16, and the trumpet, the reed. So that is what Bach meant by the prelude, the opening of this piece, the Organoplano. So I'm going to show you what that opening few measures of this piece sound like. I should mention, this is one of my favorite organ pieces, and it's definitely my mum's favorite organ piece. We're not really music geeks in my family, but we used to love this piece totally, listen to it on repeat. And you'll see why. It's the most happy, sunny, charming piece imaginable. So that really is Bach saying to his music fans, okay, let's start this on a very happy, positive note. It's the opening piece of the Bach Birthday Bash this year, and it's the opening of this third collection of published keyboard music that Bach published in 1739. And then the rest of the program really takes a sampling of that collection. I forget how many pieces there are in total. There are about 27, I think. Someone can correct me on that. But it's important to realize, Bach was a man of great faith. He absolutely, wholeheartedly believed in God and believed that it was his mission, that everything he did was really channeling, God through his music. And so at the end of his pieces, he would often put Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. It wasn't about Bach, it wasn't about him, being this revered, amazing guy. It was really on behalf of his creator, as he very strongly thought. And so this music is a dedication really to his faith. And in that sense, in Christianity, there is the symbol of the Trinity, the three persons that are actually, God is made up of three people, the Father, the guy upstairs, the Son, Jesus, who he sent down to come and live on earth for a little bit, and then he went back upstairs, and then the Holy Spirit, who at the time of Pentecost, that happens just after 6 weeks after Easter, that's sort of the Holy Ghost, the Comforter, the Paraclete, not parakeets, as I used to think when I was a kid, that is sort of everywhere running around us. And so this piece in particular, the Prelude, has in a key that we call E flat major, it's got 3 flats. So Bach loved numbers, we call it numerology. He hid little messages within his music, and of course 3 flats, the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this piece has 3 very distinct ideas. You just heard the opening. This is sort of the father, the grandfather, very serious, but also very solemn and uplifting. And then the second part of the piece is a little bit more youthful, we might say. And we think of this as perhaps the Son. And so there's our Son, and then of course we need the Holy Spirit. Now the Holy Spirit is meant to be this sort of rushing wind, and so it makes sense that this Holy Spirit is a little bit more frenetic than the rest. Here's that one. And so on. So again, this is beautiful music. It's lovely just to listen to it. But it's also, I think, really, it tells us so much about Bach as a musician when we delve a little bit deeper into what this music means and what he was thinking when he composed it. Now, this collection has all kinds of styles. We have the sort of the modern, what we call the gallant style, the sort of jumping style, which was very à la mode, to use a little French term, during the 18th century. Bach really was thought of as an old-fashioned composer by the end of his life. But that piece especially was him saying, hey, I can do the modern stuff too. I can do hip-hop, I can do rap. He didn't necessarily think that was the be-all and the end-all, like his sons, for example, who thought, oh, guys, we've got to take up these new styles and not do the old style. But of course, Bach respected the old style as well. And a little bit earlier in the 18th century, there was a form called the Trio Sonata, where you essentially had 3 elements, 2 melody parts and a bass part, and they were all equal. So they all meant the same to the music. And Bach applied that to another one of his parts of this Clavier-Übung called the Allein Gott. And this, in German, we talked about this being a German organ mass. The beginning of the mass, you have what's called the Kyrie, which is Lord, have mercy on us. You're asking for forgiveness. And then straight after that, you have the Gloria. Glory be to God on high. This is from the Christmas narrative when the shepherds were hanging out in the field, and then the angels came down and said, glory be to God on high and peace on earth, goodwill towards men. And this is Bach's setting of a hymn, a chorale, we call it in the German Lutheran tradition, that sounds like this. It's very important. You listen to this melody. So, if I were to sing the words, Allein Gott in der Höhe sei und Dank für seine Gnade. This is a tune that all of those Lutherans will be singing at the top of their voices. Now, listen to the chorale version. So this is the trio of Allein Gott. And listen to how he incorporates that. So even the first 3 notes. Allein, and then in the pedals, pom, pom, pom. It's a slower version. We call that augmentation, like stretching out a piece of chewing gum. So instead of ta-pa-pom, it's tim, tom, pom. And if I combine those two, ti, tom, tom, pom. So he's basing this on the little elements from that chorale, from that melody. And that is pure genius. This is just not just a pretty piece, pretty face, as they say. This is based on so much complexity. And in the left hand, when that comes in, ta-ta-tam, it's the same thing in another key. Absolute genius. Now, the piece that follows that is another version. It's just for keyboards, and this is based on a thing called the Catechism, which is the way that Martin Luther and many Christian traditions teach faith to adults and also to children. So Bach has some pieces in this collection for sort of the organoplano, the main organ with the feet, several manuals, and also the pedals. And then he has some pieces for just the keyboard, and this has been related to what they call the Greater Catechism and the Lesser Catechism. So again, Bach being symbolic and referencing all these other things in his music. And this one is based on the same melody, except it's in a different key. The first one was in this key, G major. This one is in A major. Now, there's another one in this collection which was in F major. So we have one in F, another one in G, and then the next one in A. Do you recognize those three notes? So, absolute genius, because the pieces themselves reference the three notes of the chorale, of the melody. So this third one is in A major, and it's just for the keyboard, and so that means I can play around with sounds on this organ that Bach would probably never have used. Let's see, maybe here is a flute, which sounds like this. And a 2-foot stop sounds like this. Now, Bach may have used a sound just like this, but have a listen to how it sounds. So I could play around with something like that. I could be a little bit more bold, perhaps, and use let's see, I don't know, the marimba. Or I could use the glockenspiel. Or maybe the harp. So that's one of the great things about this organ, because we have so many colors to choose from, that the combinations are almost limitless, and that's one of the joys of playing Bach on this amazing organ. Now, the next piece in that collection is called Wir glauben einen Gott. We all praise one God, and this is taken from it's a recitation called the Creeds. It's basically saying this is what we believe in, this is our sort of manifesto. And this, because the Lutherans love to sing, of course, this is sung to a melody, which sounds like this. Wir glauben einen Gott. So again, all of the congregations would have known these melodies very, very, very well. Now listen to that. Ya, ba, 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 and see if you recognize anything in this piece, which is cast as a fugue. He uses the beginning part of that chorale. And then it's answered above. So this is just pure genius, pure genius. That's a traditional fugue of sorts. He adds some extra free parts, but again, Bach using all these different styles to really show off to the world, hey, I am totally on top of this. I am essentially the best composer in the world, I'm better than all of you, and I'm going to prove to you exactly why. He wasn't immodest in that sense, but he really did believe that he was showing, as I said at the beginning, showing his creator, showing his absolute belief that God was sort of everywhere and responsible for everything through his music. And the more music and the more styles, the more his belief was. Now, this one I particularly like. This is Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir. You can hear from the German, it's a very sort of longing Lenten text. Aus tiefer, out of the depth, I cry unto thee. This is taken from the Hebrew book of Psalms. I forget exactly which one, but the melody, again, very beautiful. These melodies were mostly written by Martin Luther himself. Some of them were based on plain chant from the Roman Catholic tradition. Some of them were totally new. And this one sounds like this. And the text, Aus tiefer Noth schrei ich zu dir. And so, again, everyone would have known that. When he puts this into the chorale prelude, it's for 6 parts. Now, 6 parts, what do I have? 2 hands and 2 feet. What is that supposed to mean? I only have 5 keyboards. Most organs have 2, 3, maybe 4 if you're lucky. So what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, Bach is very clever because he starts and adds more parts. You think most music has 3, maybe 4 parts, perhaps 5. 6 is just very, very clever to fit all of that stuff into the texture. So I'm going to play the opening a little bit more quietly than I will do in the concert, otherwise you won't hear me speak. But here's the beginning. This is part number 1. Again, he's quoting the chorale melody. Here's part number 2. Here's part number 3. Here's part number 4. Part number 5 in the pedals. Now here's part number 6 in the pedals also. So I don't know if you can hear that clearly, but the pedal is playing a bass part. And at the same time, it's playing that chorale melody. So one foot's doing one, the other foot's doing the other. Here's the chorale melody. No hands. Ta, 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 dee. Absolute genius. And when all of that is put together, you wouldn't necessarily even know that that was happening. But the fact that that much thought and skill has gone into the construction is just marvelous. So that is one of the best. But the absolute best thing in the collection, I think, is the final movement. It's the fugue. So a fugue literally means to sort of chase, and fugues were one of Bach's favorite compositional forms. And they always start with a single melody. We call the subjects. It's a little bit like you're writing an essay. You start with the subject, and then you expand on that subject. But that subject travels through. It's the sort of the building block of the whole piece. And again, this fugue is in E flat major, 3 flats, the Holy Trinity, 3 persons, 1 God, and there are 3 distinct sections representing, we might say, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Now, Bach didn't tell us that's what they represent, but we have sort of implied that over the years through musicology. And it starts out like this. And here's the second voice. And here's the third one. And here's the fourth one. And so on, and then the 5th one comes in the pedal. Only 5 voices in this piece, but that's pretty hard. Those of you who write counterpoint, you know that even composing 3 or 4 part counterpoint is pretty challenging. It's a fabulous piece. You will hear on the concert that I am not performing this with traditional, you might say more conservative pipe organ sounds. At the end, I think it's such a powerful piece. There's so much energy and emotion, specifically because this is the end of his collection. That I really pull out literally, not all the stops, but almost all of them. So you'll need to make sure you tune your TV sets to make sure it doesn't explode at the end of this piece. But fabulous, fabulous music. So that's really the bulk of that part of the program. And then the next part of the program are arrangements of pieces. One of them is a piece by Antonio Vivaldi, who was the great 18th century violinist based in Venice, in Italy, and composed lots of string music and string concertos, which is really showy music for solo instruments. And also the orchestra that's kind of the backup band. And this became all the rage in the early 1700s, so much so that Bach's employer, the young Prince Johann Ernst, went to study in Amsterdam and brought back stacks of these pieces and essentially, said to Bach, his composer and his court musician, hey, I want you to write music in this style because it's really, really exciting. And you'll hear the energy in this music is just fabulous. Here is the opening of this concerto. So this was written by Vivaldi. There are not really any notes well, Bach made a few what he would call improvements, but 99% of this is Antonio Vivaldi's music, but arranged, taken from the orchestra, and arranged for the solo organ to sort of make that orchestral, virtuosic effect on the organ. Have a listen to it. Solo violins, played on a different keyboard. And the full orchestra. And the violins. So you can see the Bach using the organ to simulate the full sound and the solo texture. Absolute genius. They're also incredibly difficult because Bach is trying to take all of those parts, combine them for one human being to play, and especially in the Vivaldi's concertos always have three movements, a fast, a slow, and a fast. The last movement is absolutely bonkers because it requires, like that piece, the Aus tiefer note, you have to use both feet to play different notes. So halfway through we have the, let's see. I think this is probably a viola in the orchestra, but then we have to have the bass part. Again, that's just played by the feet. Then you have to have the solo and the orchestra playing along. And so on. I mean, this is really the peak of virtuosity for organ music, and that remains the way for almost 100 years. Bach's music is never easy, but those transcriptions are particularly challenging. And then the program closes out with another composer playing Bach at his own game. So the Chromatic, Fantasia, and Fugue was actually just called the Fantasia. We don't have Bach's manuscript. That's where he actually wrote the notes down himself. Instead, what we have are copies by his pupils and by his followers, people who wanted to play this piece for themselves. Again, you didn't just go online and download the music and put it on your iPad. You had to actually find a copy or find somebody who had a copy and make your own version. So it's become known as the Chromatic, Fantasia, and Fugue. There's that word again. The end is the final part is a fugue. And this piece was originally written for harpsichord, maybe clavichord. And so if it were written for harpsichord, they often have two manuals, two keyboards, a louder stop and then a quieter stop, and you can couple them together, a little bit like an organ, not nearly as much color. But this was arranged at the turn of the last century, 1901 to 2, by Max Reger, who was one of the towering figures of the high German Romantic music period. He wrote music with more black on the paper than white because there's so many notes. His organ music in particular is highly virtuosic and really designed for an organ just like this. And so if you know this piece, you'll know that it relies on having that very crisp articulation from the harpsichord. Well, you don't get that from the organ, and certainly not from the kind of organ that Reger would have been playing. So if I play the opening of this, it's much more of a powerful legato romantic style. you probably heard in the beginning there, we went from really loud to really quiet and something in between. Now this piece is an arrangement, a transcription of extremes. So, and one of the reasons I love playing it on this organ is it allows me to use all of the stops, all the different colors of the organ, from the quietest possible sound you could ever imagine to the very loudest. And I'm just going to show you a little bit at the end, which sounds a bit like this. And you'll hear the organ go really loud, and then it quietens down to almost nothing. And then it gets off on its merry way again. So this is a wonderful piece. I think I use just about every solo sound on this organ. Apart from the percussion, I don't get to use the percussion on a piece like this. But maybe in a few years when I build up the courage. But as I say, just about every other sound. And the end of it has this extraordinary energy, this drive, that is very Bachian. Again, if we brought Johann Sebastian into Merrill, he'd be very confused by the artificial lighting, for one. And the fact the organ console is controlled, electronically. There's no physical connection to the organ keys. But I think he would relate to the energy and the drive of this music. And so, again, that's going to close out the program. I'm really looking forward to playing for you. And remember, you can join us live, or you can watch it online. And I think we maybe have a few minutes for a few questions, if you have anything specific.
I hope I'm making sense of this one. About transcription.
Mm-hmm.
If they were done when the original composer was alive, how did that person feel when say a Bach would, or the Vivaldi piece, and I can't remember the timing,
Mm-hmm.
but was that a good thing, or were musicians kind of careful about holding on to their music?
Yeah, well, intellectual property did not exist in the clear way. Well, some people might say it's not quite as clear as it could be even today, but the idea of copying music, I think it was more of a given, that the way people learned in those days was to copy out music. Nowadays, if I went to a living composer and copied out their music, well, I'd get a big slap on the wrist and a big fine from the government, because I've essentially copied, I've made that my music, which isn't fair. But in the 18th century, and certainly well into the 19th century, it would be much more of just a thing you did. You copied someone's music, that's how you learned. Maybe they thought it was flattering. I'm not sure that Vivaldi ever heard, that Bach had copied out his music, but surely he knew that he had copied other people's music. And certainly Bach copied music and had his music copied by others during his lifetime, including his students. That's one of the ways that he taught. He would give them a piece and they would copy it out, and then they would play it for him. And one of the reasons we have pieces by Bach that exist now is because those copies of copies exist, and they may even have some markings that Bach wrote in, leant over his pupil and said, "Oh, why don't you place this here, or it's this ornament there?" So I think the idea of copying was much more flexible back in those days.
Another question I got via email was, you've done a few Bach programs at Fogo. How do you develop a theme when you're deciding on the program content? Like, how did you decide on the theme internally for this program?
Yeah, it's tricky because Bach's music is by definition abstract. It's not programmatic in the sense that it's music about happiness, or music about sadness, or music about dance, or music about love or death, or a more sort of dramatic, programmatic content. So I try and think really about, well, I'll be totally honest, about pieces I love to play. I love playing that E-flat Prelude and Fugue from the Clavier-Übung, so I thought, well, I've got to put that down. And then because that's part of that bigger collection, the Clavier-Übung, the third part, I thought, well, I want to show off the smaller sounds of this organ. I mean, this organ does the loud stuff, of course, eminently well, but it's really the quieter stops of this organ that are the most beautiful. And then I wanted to contrast that with, that's all bright and happy and chirpy. Well, I wanted to make sure I got some of the more sort of dirge-like music in, and I want to use some of the loud stops like the tuba. and the big reeds. And also what we call the strings that this organ is so famous for. You'd never use this normally in Bach. So I really wanted to choose pieces that I could use those within the program. So really it was a balance of things, and then you just sort of have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then the program just comes together organically. No pun intended.
Nope, that was all my questions that I received.
I see something on here. Oh, I see.
A lot of thank yous and people really enjoying the program.
Oh, such a pleasure.
Now a lot of questions.
Awesome. You know, somebody asked last time, how does this organ compare to the organ that Bach played at the St. Thomas Church, which was where he was when he wrote this music? And the fact is, apart from the reality of having keyboards and the same basic position of the black and the white notes and the pedals, they would have been very different because Bach's organ was much smaller than this, although his organs commonly had 3, sometimes 4 keyboards. We have 5, so the Germans, in particular, the North Germans, had these extraordinary engineering skills. The pipe organ itself in the 18th century really was the summit of human engineering up until the 19th century industrial age. And so when you played a pipe organ, that was kind of the next thing to God. And I think people knew that when they were listening because the sounds produced were awe-inspiring. They would totally envelop you in the big acoustic of the churches that they would have been placed in. So in that sense, the Kotzschmar organ does the same thing. You have to really experience it from inside this hall because there's nothing like it. Hearing those sounds bouncing off the walls, coming from the ceiling and the front, it's just amazing. And I think that Bach would have related to, but all of the mod cons we have, as I think I've talked about before, I can push buttons and the sounds of the organ change immediately. When Bach wanted to change a sound, he had to go over and pull the stop out, often a good 4, 5, 6 inches to make the physical movement within the organ, which would have been way up there. And normally he would have to have people doing that. And Bach didn't have an automatic blower making the wind. Of course, that had to be done by hand, so he had some of his choristers whose voices had changed, stepping on the bellows, making the air. And the louder the piece, the more air you had to create, especially with the bass pipe. So they would have been going like this, up and down, up and down. It was exhausting. And of course, they couldn't practice at nighttime without candlelight. So they would probably have practiced during the day and then used a smaller keyboard instrument or a clavichord to practice in their own homes. Of course, they didn't have heating either, so organ practice in the wintertime, especially around Bach's birthday in Germany at that time of year. Whew, very cold.
You're getting requests.
Oh.
How about a little toccata and fugue in D minor?
Oh boy. I hate to say it, guys, but this piece is almost certainly not by Bach. The idea is definitely there, but for those of you who don't know this piece, there's probably nobody. It sounds like this. And so on. A fantastic piece. Musicologists say it's a spurious attribution because, again, we don't have Bach's copy that says, my name is Johann Sebastian Bach and I wrote this piece. We just have copies of copies of copies, and so it's unclear to us exactly what he wrote. But then again, the chromatic Fantasia in Fugue in D minor, which is kind of the same vibe, I played a little bit earlier. Etc. It's not dissimilar, and there's no other piece that Bach wrote that is like the chromatic Fantasia and Fugue. So maybe there's hope for the Toccata and Fugue yet. But of course, I played it last year in the Bach Birthday Bash, and it's absolutely a marvelous piece, whether it's by Bach or inspired by Bach or a little bit by Bach. Yeah, absolutely.
I did get another question. What's an entry-level Bach piece?
Good question. Entry-level Bach. It's like entry-level Shakespeare. Well, but it's a very good question. And of course, Bach was a teacher. He had many children and many pupils. And there is many pieces that we know he used to teach music. Mostly, of course, they would start playing on the keyboard first before they learnt the organ. And they would get really quite advanced skills on the keyboard. The Germans use the word Clavier, which literally means keyboard, whether that's the clavichord or the organ or the harpsichord. Didn't really have a piano in the sense that we think of the modern piano now, which is just everywhere in the music world. Bach did play an early version of the piano, we think, but it was like a prototype prone to going wrong. So he would have made sure his pupils played music by him and much earlier composers from the 17th century, like Buxtehude and Walter. But in terms of organ pieces, he wrote a collection, he didn't publish, sadly, but he was going to, called the Orgelbüchlein, the Little Organ Book. And this is a collection of chorale preludes, like the ones from the Clavier-Übung, that range in difficulty, but they're all fairly short. Some of them are just 30, 40 seconds long. And those pieces are very good to start with in terms of organ technique for the the budding organist. And there are also these pieces called the Little Preludes and Fugues, which almost certainly, again, aren't by Bach, but he may have used them, or his pupils may have written them, and he may have taught them, again, to get a very preliminary organ technique before he went on to the big piece, the big boy pieces, as it were. So yeah, the Orgelbüchlein, lots of lovely pieces, and some of the organ chorales, and the little organ preludes and fugues. Awesome. Well, I think that is our time. But this was such a pleasure, everybody. And as I say, and as Shireen says, if you have any questions for us, please put them in the comments or reach us through our Facebook page or send us an email via our website, foko.org, and we'll gladly answer them. And I hope to see you for the live stream on Saturday, 2 weeks hence. And if you can't join us live, then please sign up and you can watch it at your leisure as many times as you like afterwards. Thanks so much, everyone.